it's fantastic, and I'm quite excited to be talking about this subject. It's something that's close to my heart, and I think first off, thank you, Trishla, and I'd like to start by saying that by no means am I sort of a trained art historian. This is something I fell into, and while putting this talk together, I realized how my own understanding of Indian art history is patchy at the best of times. More importantly, I realized that art history, like history, is not a neat and tidy linear narrative, where one artistic revolution and the resulting movement follows the other. It is messy at the best of times. More importantly, the future doesn't arrive at once for everyone. There are ebbs and flows, and it's almost impossible to capture all of these in the time allotted to me, which is about 45 minutes, and I'm probably going to go a little bit over. I'd like to state at the outset that there are several great artists that I could not include in the presentation. I'll be presenting a fairly subjective history for this period, leaving out things that didn't fit the narrative and adding on elements that I simply couldn't do without. One thing that seemed glaringly missing from the art history that we follow is the absence of women as artists and protagonists. Unfortunately, while we know of a few women artists who were active in the first half of the 20th century in India, there's scanty scholarship about their work at the best of times. So that's an omission that is a systemic problem, and one that that periods of this presentation also might suffer from. But I ask you to bear with me, and I hope we can discuss that later on as well. The links that I've tried to show here are that of influence and continuance, how art and ideas move through time and forge new trajectories. Artists everywhere in the world look towards history, antiquity, nature, and other artists for inspiration. While such sparks act as a starting point for artists, and they are propelled forward by the inflection points in history and by the events that concern their daily lives and those that affect the world that they inhabit. By the end of this talk, we will see how history and politics have shaped the art of modern India as we know it today. Also, for aesthetic reasons, I have stuck mostly to paintings, prints, and two-dimensional works of art for most of the period that we will be discussing. Now, the question which I didn't anticipate when starting this, or starting to write this this talk, was the problem that histories, wherever they start, there's always a before. You know, there's always a before that affects the after. So in order to talk about the period that we're going to be discussing today, I have to start before that period, which lands us squarely in the late 18th century, when a whole host of artists from Europe and the United Kingdom were making their way to India to make their mark, and if they were lucky, a small fortune in the process. Among these artists was Johann Zoffany, who created this tour de force of a painting in the late 18th century. I invite all of you to look closely at this painting and try to read it with me. In the foreground, we see two birds being pitted against each other by these two men. But really, this is a metaphor, a larger metaphor for the context of India at the time. We see a fit, tight as a whip Englishman talking to a rather corpulent Indian gentleman, probably arguing over some sort of a bet that they've got going on the results of a certain game. Each of the Europeans and Indians in the painting, whether over here or here, are distinguishable by the clothes they wear and the skin color. The Europeans are under a large canopy, while the Indian drama plays out outside of it. And Zoffany himself can be seen here sitting and looking on with an almost bored expression on his face at the drama that's unfolding in the picture. Such paintings, along with this portrait of Shuja'ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Awadh by Tilly Kettle, and Tilly Kettle, by the way, is a man, though his name sounds might indicate otherwise, is described as the European academic style. These are characterized by the almost true to life and perhaps slightly airbrushed reality, accompanied by an air of romanticism that we see in these paintings. For over a century in India, this remained the preserve of artists who traveled to India from Europe. The company rule also made way for art schools later on, training both Indian artists and draftsmen with their European counterparts in the Western academic style. I'd like to draw your attention to the incredible details of this painting. The European style fur draped over his shoulders and the gold zari and brocade robes that he seems to be wearing, along with the almond shaped gold buttons that we see just over here on his robes. And the bow, which seems largely ceremonial because the decoration on it that he's gripping in his right hand. In the late 19th century, we see a shift within the academic style with artists like Raja Ravi Verma. Raja Ravi Verma is a Travancore aristocrat whose talent is recognized early on, and he receives training in oil painting with a Dutch portrait painter. Ravi Verma has a unique ability to reconcile Western aesthetics and techniques with Indian sensibilities. Look at the side profile of a young woman dressed in a crimson sari and with a gold embroidered blouse, with flowers in her hair adorned with some exquisite jewelry. Unlike the portrait of Shuja'ud-Dawla, we get a sensitive, almost private portrait of the subject here. The subject seems to be accorded with a dignity and modesty that we don't see European painters accord to their Indian subjects. One observer at the time noted that Raja Ravi Verma is incredibly popular with the populace of India and was famous even for his day. His decision to depict Indian subjects in the Western academic style was completely novel and allowed Indians a new way of looking at themselves. He also created paintings of religious and mythical characters that were mass produced and disseminated widely by the Ravi Verma press that he later established. Wittingly or unwittingly, Ravi Verma becomes the first in a long line of modern Indian painters. Verma is credited with elevating the status of real women, and real here in inverted commas, that he painted almost to the level of national symbols of feminine beauty, even as he retained their original identities. Take, for example, this depiction of the goddess Lakshmi. She's dressed in a red sari with a gold border, not unlike something that women wore at the time. In fact, it's actually not very different from how a woman wearing a similar sari today might appear. He places her on a lotus, and Lakshmi, with her luminous skin, radiates a soft beauty combined with a sense of inner strength and intelligence that goes beyond the exterior. The academic style really reaches its zenith under Ravi Verma, and as he succeeds in creating an idealized face and visual iconography that is unique to the subcontinent, and a new movement is afoot. Some of you might recall at this point that in the early 1900s, in 1905 to be specific, Lord Curzon partitions the state of Bengal into a majority Muslim East and a largely Hindu West, in response to which the Swadeshi movement picks up steam, especially amongst the intellectual circles in Calcutta. The similarities between the painting that we just saw by Raja Ravi Verma and this one by the artist Abanindranath Tagore is undeniable. Abanindranath in 1905 somehow synthesizes the Western allegorical figures such as Europa and Britannia with the imagery and humanized conception of Indian gods and goddesses that Ravi Verma had pioneered to create this figure, the Bharat Mata. In her hands, she holds a book, sheaves of paddy, a piece of white cotton cloth, and a garland. Elements that symbolize learning, the Indian economy, the largely agrarian population, and the spirituality of India. The young goddess, dressed in a simple saffron sari with a halo radiating behind her head, standing on lotuses. This painting is loaded with metaphors and references, the most important of which being that India is a young and wise country steeped in spirituality. With the movement that Abanindranath came to pioneer in the wake of the Swadeshi movement, there was a sense that anything that was inflected with the Western academic style was derivative and colonial and perhaps completely without aesthetic merit. He very consciously looks to the Indian past, especially to the cave paintings of Ajanta and Ellora. And over here, we see two examples of that. Very clearly, you can see the eyebrows and the stylized way in which the eyes and the mouths and the faces are rendered, the broad shoulders, and the detailing with which the jewelry and other adornments are displayed. This is something, and please pay attention to the color palette as well. And by the way, Ajanta, the Ajanta paintings were created 1500 years prior to this period, in the year between 450 and 500. And that's what we're really looking at over here. 1500-year-old Indian art, untouched by colonial rule, so to speak. But at the same time, he also looked at Indian miniature paintings that came to their zenith, according to some art historians, under the Mughals. So,
Keshav,
yeah.
hi, sorry, just requesting you to speak a little bit slowly if possible. Thank
There's
you.
a lot of ground to cover, so I've been going a little fast.
I know, because some things might not be fully audible at some time, so just slightly slow.
I understand. And is it better if I hold my mic up? Does that make it more audible?
It is clear, but just the pace a little bit.
Sure.
Thank you. Sorry to disturb you.
No. Thanks for letting me know. And we see that in this painting that Abanindranath paints at some point in the 1920s. You know, the way the eyebrows are rendered, the shape of the face, the way the eyes extend beyond the face in some cases, the way the snake is painted around Shiva's neck. There is this borrowing of imagery and iconography from the Ajanta caves. Another thing that we see is the technique itself. He's using a wash technique that was pioneered in other Asian civilizations like China and Japan. And in fact, we see another element from those civilizations, which is the use of the red seal, which is used in both China and Japan to mark either the author of a work of art, in their cases, scroll paintings or pieces of ceramic, or the ownership of the painting. And we see this marriage between, and very consciously looking towards influence from Eastern civilizations and incorporating them into their own work with Abanindranath Tagore. Some of the other Tagores who are involved in this movement are folks like Gagendranath Tagore, whose painting we're looking at over here. Excuse me for 1 second. In the 1920s, the Tagores brought an exhibition of woodcuts by German artists, some of whom were part of the Bauhaus school, to Calcutta. And this is a tremendously impactful exhibition and introduces many of the artists who are working in Calcutta at the time to concepts like cubism. And we see that playing out in this very delicate watercolor, again created in the wash technique by Gagendranath. We see the central figure of Bhishma Pitama, lying in a sleeping position on a bed of arrows. So he's depicting a scene from the Mahabharata at the end of the war when Bhishma is lying dying on the bed of arrows that has been created for him by Arjun, I believe. And as you can see, it's incredibly stylized. We see a horse in the foreground. We see other elements of royalty and martial cultures in the background. And there's an incredible inner luminosity that paintings like this are able to imbue, the artists like Gagendranath are able to imbue in their painting. The third and perhaps most famous Tagore, who had a major influence on what we now know as the Bengal school, was Rabindranath Tagore himself. Tagore came to painting at the age of 60 with no real training to speak of. However, his aesthetic sense was apparent in the calligraphic writing style even early on. Given his unusual choice of colors, experts actually speculate that Tagore might have been red-green colorblind, but we'll never really know that. But his larger influence came through the setting up of Kala Bhavan with the aid of artists like Nandlal Bose at Viswa Bharati University, which he had established a few years earlier in the year 1990. With that, that brings us to Nandlal Bose. Now, Nandlal is a transitional figure because he was one of the original artists tapped by Abanindranath Tagore to accompany him to the caves of Ajanta and to take inspiration and to develop this new national art in the wake of the Swadeshi movement. And we see elements of that in his work as well. For example, this very delicately painted watercolor in the wash technique that was pioneered by Abanindranath and his followers, as well as in this highly stylized painting of a very traditional Indian subject, which is the Ardhanarishwar form of Shiva. He's taking from the Ajanta caves, paintings of the Ajanta caves, but also from the southern Indian temples, etc. Later on, however, we see Nandalal breaking out of the Abanindranath Tagore mold. Because there was this sense that of almost feeling stifled, because the idea of what constituted Indian painting to the first wave of the Bengal school was very specific and defined, and only certain subjects and types of painting were considered a quote unquote Indian painting. We see Nandlal breaking out of that, and really him and his generation of artists, especially the artists that they will go on to train at Santiniketan at the Viswabharati University, will take on more elements from the folk traditions, such as the Pat painters of Odisha and Kalighat artists. Over here, we see Nandlal Bose using the lino cut technique to create an almost iconic image of Gandhiji that we still know today, and it's so graphically simple and made in a way that's easily reproducible. That it later created the marching Gandhi into an icon that we know to this day, and it's been reproduced in sculptures, posters, paintings alike. A few years later, Gandhiji would tap Nandlal Bose for the commission of the Haripura, for the commission of the posters for the Haripura Congress. And we see Nandlal somehow manages to bring together the Odisha Patichitra style, and makes it completely his own and imbues it with his own hand and aesthetic sensibilities, which Gandhi can claim is a truly Indian style. Over here, we can see him sharing the work, in fact, this very painting with Gandhiji in 1938. However, I'd like to draw your attention to the signature on the work. It's still marked with a red seal, like Chinese and Japanese scroll paintings. And this is an element that he keeps from his teacher and mentor, Abanindranath Tagore. He signs his name in a small scroll of script of Bengali underneath it. Perhaps the artist who takes the folk aesthetic the furthest is the artist Jamini Roy. And we can see in his work a certain romanticization of the Indian domestic and village life, and a desire to create almost icons out of them, creating a visual vocabulary wherein he could translate almost anything: animals, plants, domestic and biblical scenes, and render them in a way that is unmistakably his own. Far away from Calcutta in the 1930s, something quite unusual turns up. Someone quite unusual turns up, I should say, and that's Amrita Shergill, the child of a Hungarian opera singer and a Sikh aristocrat father. Amrita Shergill arrives in Lahore to discover her Indian lineage. Trained in Paris with a modernist background, Amrita spent a considerable time as a young adult in Europe. Painted in 1933, this self-portrait was made during one of her summers that she spent in Hungary. The light hitting the side of this face, hitting the side of her face, surrounded by the dark colors of her clothes and hair, and the background, lends an almost chiaroscuro like effect to the work. Her lips become the focal point of the painting, drawing the viewer's attention towards them. Unsatisfied and longing for more, Amrita travels throughout India. She painted prolifically during this time and established herself as an Indian artist. In her quest to paint in India, she had to rely on her Western education, but shed the aesthetics that she was used to from this period. And on her travel itinerary are the same things. The Ajanta caves, the temples of South India, these are places she visits and tries to imbibe her learning from what she sees over here into her work. And in this painting too, we see the same use of the thin eyebrows and the extended eyes and the pouting lips that we see in the Ajanta cave paintings. In fact, even the color palette is one of browns and ochres and reds and greens to imbue that sense of a certain Indian color palette, for lack of a better term, that she saw when she visited these older sites of Indian art. I think there was also a certain disenchantment with what she saw around her vis-a-vis the Bengal school, etc. at this time. Unfortunately, Amrita dies rather young in the early 1940s at the age of 28, and we aren't able to see the full extent of her career. But even what she's left behind is considered so important that the government has marked any work of hers as a non-exportable national art treasure, if in India. So, and her works are some of the most prized by collectors and museums alike. Now we come to 1947. In 1947, we have a complete breakdown in the social contract between patron, artist, and viewer. And of course, the independence that makes that happen. And we have something interesting happen in Bombay, where a group of young artists, namely Francis Newton Souza, K.H. Ara, Raza, Gade, Sadanand Bakre, and M.F. Hussain, who can be seen here at their first exhibition, sitting in front of two paintings by Souza and one by Hussain, whereas this is a painting that Raza did. The only figure recognizable in the painting is Raza himself. We're not quite sure who the other two are. But these are the artists who very consciously want to reject everything that has come before, and develop a new way of looking at art. Even the name Progressive Artist Group is an interesting one, because prior to the existence of the group, which was founded post-independence in 1947, we have the Progressive Writers Association, which exists in Bombay and had such luminaries as Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Saadat Hassan Manto, and Ismat Chugtai as part of their ranks. And that group had really set out to create a more liberal, outward-looking, open-minded, avant-garde writing in Indian literary circles. So one can see where they were drawing their inspiration from. And with the progressives, there's a real sense of being as expressive as possible. And we see this in the use of heavy impasto, of loud, almost interestingly garish color combinations with reds, yellows, blues, whites, all going onto the canvas at once. We see it with Souza specifically in this early painting of his from 1948, when he's just about 24 years old, titled, which is a crucifixion scene. Now, what's interesting here is that we see the beginnings of that machismo and heavy impasto and expressivity, but 10 years later, the art, while all of those things, has also got a certain edge and brutality to it. In this crucifixion, we see that even Jesus himself is not spared. He's shown as a pitiable figure, moth-eaten and destroyed by the torture meted out to him at the hands of his captors. The figures at the base of the cross do seem to be almost mutilated and somehow distorted into their grotesqueness. And really what we're seeing over here is Souza trying to talk about a God that isn't a forgiving or loving God, but perhaps a cruel God, a God that's retributive in his functioning. We see it again in this portrait. Souza is famous for his heads and the faces that he creates. And over here too, we see a couple laughing, their teeth grotesquely visible, the hair, beards, mouth, everything kind of mixes into one. And it's really, he's really trying to bring forth the ugliness and grotesqueness which he believes that hides inside all us humans. And we must realize this is coming at the feet of the Second World War, where incredible horrors have been witnessed across the world. Indian army soldiers were returning with gruesome injuries, and the horrible stories of Holocaust and later partition in India were all that these artists were familiar with, and was the fodder that led to the kind of art that they were making at this point. We see it even in his landscapes, where the lines are, where it's a Gothic city. It's not a city with wide boulevards. And by the way, by this point, Souza is living in London. So this is the vision of London that he has too. It's a city that's a mess. That is. This is not where civilized people live, right? Like this is, it's ugly, it's dark, it's hideous in its own way, and that's really what he's trying to bring to the fore. With Raza, we see a slightly different impulse. Very early on into the life of the Progressive Artist Group in the late 40s, 1948, in fact, Raza meets the photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson, who's visiting India on assignment. And Cartier-Bresson tells him about France and the art scene over there. And soon, within a couple of years, we see Raza moving to Paris and to France, where he lives for the next 50 or so years, right up to the late 2010s or so, when sorry the early 2000s or mid 2000s, when he moves back to India. And what we see is a certain development towards pure abstraction with him. But even then, in this painting titled Rajasthan, slightly later in his career, we see an artist who's referencing Rajasthan not only as a place, but also a culture that has produced things like miniature paintings. We see the form of the miniature paintings in his canvases, whether it's the red border that goes around them, whether it's the colors that are employed in them, or the slightly horizontal square formats that these paintings employ. So it's sort of an all over reappraisal of the idea of abstraction. In Raza's case, he's really trying to grapple with what it's like to make an Indian art. And what he arrives at eventually in the late 70s and early 80s is the idea of the Bindu, or the cosmic egg from the Upanishads. At this point, he's really scouring Indian texts, because anything that has come before to him feels like a foreign art, an art that he made that wasn't truly his own. And this is and with the Bindu, he truly comes into himself in the later part of his career. The Bindu operates as the cosmic seed, the egg from which everything appears: land, earth, sea, represented in by the different colors around the Bindu, are all encompassed in it and come out of it. With Hussain, we see an almost romanticized view of the people of India, and his paintings are heavily symbolic and allegorical. Hussain famously had a career as a signboard painter and a commercial artist before joining the Progressive Artist Group. And we see over here his strong draftsmanship skills, even in this early canvas from the year 1950, which is currently in the Peabody Essex Museum, titled Rhythm of Life. In the late 1940s, Hussain visits an exhibition at the Rashtrapati Bhavan with Sousa, where he looks at the art of India throughout the ages, and he realizes that there's very little that he is doing at that time which can contribute to that lineage. And he says this, and I quote, "I deliberately picked up 2 or 3 periods from Indian art history. One was the classical period of the Guptas, the very sensuous forms of the female body. Next was the Basholi period, the strong colors of the Basholi miniatures. And the last was the folk element." And we see all of those on display over here, whether it's the almost flat cutout like monolithic figures from murals that decorate the walls of the Ajanta caves, to the strong colors of reds, greens, and yellows, and ochres, really, earth colors that we see him using. This is a painting from his seminal Man series, and it's heavily laden with symbols like the bull, a recurring theme in his paintings, the forms of the Gupta idols in the wide-hipped sculptural female forms that we see laid out across the painting. And really, he's about creating that synthesis, which he develops further in his career. And towards the later part of his career, he paints his own Bharat Mata, a reinterpretation of the concept that Abhinendranath had pioneered exactly 100 years before this painting was made in the year 2005. Now, this is a painting that sparked a huge amount of furore for Hussain, and he eventually left India as a result of this painting and a few others that were considered controversial. He depicts Bharat Mata in the nude. Now, and that is hard for certain parts of the society to digest. And we really see him reinterpreting it in a way where Bharat Mata is once again a woman, not a deity, not a four-armed goddess, but really a figure, herself the shape of India, as one can see the shape of the peninsular India in her form. He references trade, yoga, and the eternal wheel of progress and time that India has embodied. One figure and a certain part of art history that is often left behind is what's happening simultaneously in 1947 with some of the artists who are operating in Delhi. There is a huge contingent of artists who arrived from cities like Lahore, who've seen the horrors of partition. And really, 1947 is not as much independence for them as it is partition, as it is accompanied with a sense of loss of home and place and culture. And chief amongst them is the practitioner B.C. Sanyal, who actually ran an art school for many years in Lahore. In Sanyal, we see the influence of another famous Lahori artist, Amrita Shergill, who we discussed a short while ago, in his figures, in the use of the white color, and also in the stylized eyes and nose and mouths that Amrita had borrowed from Ajanta when she had synthesized with Ajanta when she was painting decades earlier. We see in another example of the work by the artist Satish Gujral, himself a refugee, where he's really talking about the despair and anguish caused to people by this fracture in history, time, and for most people, the loss of home that it caused. Now, the interesting thing about Satish Gujral is he visits Mexico around this time and is exposed to the murals of the great artists Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo and other Mexican muralists who are painting these great odes to the worker and farmers onto the government buildings in Mexico. In fact, Satish later would go on to create murals for Indian government buildings as well, some of which can still be seen in Delhi. In Ram Kumar, we have another figure looking at, in Ram Kumar, we have another figure who's really looking at archetypes of people. These are two paintings titled The Graduate, Unemployed Graduates, and Vagabond. And it's really about the anonymous, button-eyed young men who are completely disillusioned with city life, and they kind of begin to resemble one another. And there's a certain depression in there. We see him moving away from that somehow in the early 1960s when he visits Benares, and he sees a city that in itself is imbued with such pathos and character that he no longer feels the need to depict human figures in the painting in order to impart that feeling. And slowly with Ramkumar, we see a move away from landscapes where we can still make out buildings and a water body in this early painting of Benares to almost pure abstraction. But landscape is still very much part of this, of his abstraction, and is very much the basis of it. We see other artists like Jahangir Sabawala and Akbar Padamsi also explore abstract landscape painting, and it really comes to its zenith in the 1970s. In case of Padamsi and Sabawala, incidentally, like Ramkumar, both of them had spent time in Paris. Whether that's a coincidence or something that lent them to look at landscapes in this abstract way is something that we can explore later. Another thread that's apparent in Indian abstract painting is that of neo-tantrism, and the real pioneers of it are artists like K.C.S. Panikkar, and this painting is by the artist G.R. Santosh, who seemed to have a mystical experience sometime in the 60s that moved him so deeply that he started painting these spiritual tantric paintings that are inspired by an older tradition of tantric painting that exists in the miniature painting and Rajasthani painting traditions as well. Another proponent of the same was the artist Biren Dey, and this is another landmark painting by him in that same vein. So really trying to encompass spirituality that they feel is inherent in Indian culture in the paintings as well. No discussion of abstraction in India is complete without mentioning Gaitonde. Now, Gaitonde in the 50s reads, Gaitonde actually since quite early on was also creating these abstract paintings even in the 1950s, but we really see him somehow incorporate the ideas of Zen philosophy in the early 60s, in the late 1950s, early 60s onwards in his paintings, and he's really trying to capture the ineffable. What are the things that cannot be said? And most of his canvases are therefore untitled, vertical compositions that one is supposed to sort of fall into. In 1964, he goes to New York, where he's exposed to the work of the abstract expressionists, including Mark Rothko, and that is a parallel that people often draw between Rothko's work and Gaitonde's work. Here's another canvas where he's really also giving up the tool of the paintbrush, which is the traditional medium, which is the traditional tool of painters, and using rollers. And we see that in the broad strokes that we see across the canvas in his paintings, really pulling the width, pulling the gesso and the paint along with it as it moves forward, leaving behind no trace of the handiwork of the artist himself. Now, most of you would be forgiven to think that this too is a painting by Gaitonde, but this is in fact a painting by Nasreen Mohammadi, and an early painting by Nasreen Mohammadi from 1963. Very few of her canvases are known to this date because the medium that she truly, how do we say, embraced was the pared down medium of paper. And this is not one of her drawings, but in fact, it's a photograph that she took in Fatehpur Sikri. Now, photography was an important part of her practice because it informed the drawings that she would later do. But the photographs themselves never saw the light of day during her lifetime. And it was only after she passed away quite early on in her life, in the 1990s, in 1990, in fact, that the photographs were shown for the first time in a major retrospective that happened. But it's really working with paper and informing herself with abstract things like music, like light, and trying to capture that idea and those ineffable things in her artworks. That we see her really coming into her own and becoming a figure to be reckoned with and doing something that's never been done before. Here's another example of her incredibly detailed line drawings that she did at the time. Now, the 1970s are an interesting time because this is when we really see Baroda as an art center come to the fore. In the early 1950s, the MS University in Baroda was established by visionaries such as K.G. Subramaniam, N.S. Bendre, Sonko Chaudhary, and K.K. Heber. But it's really in the 60s and 70s, after the first and second generation of students have gone through the school, that we see a certain narrative element become a major part of the art that's coming out of Baroda. I'm showing you 4 out of 12 small paintings titled "When Champa Grew Up" by the artist Nilima Sheikh. We see an entire lifetime of this girl Champa. And this is the first panel on the top left, where we see Champa riding a bicycle. A few panels down, we see her at her wedding ceremony. And a little bit later on in the series, we see a room, possibly a kitchen, set ablaze on fire. It seems as though Champa was murdered by the family that she's married into over dowry or some sort of other issue like that. And we see that we see women here mourning her loss, and they are just women. We don't see men included in this. And it's really about specificity. While they talk about big ideas, the artists that are coming out of Baroda really use specific references. In this case, the story of Champa. These are not large allegorical ideas shown with symbolic characters, but about specific people and and their specific stories. In this painting titled "City for Sale" by the artist Ghulam Sheikh, we see 3 figures. I mean, first of all, I think we're hit by the psychedelic colors and the all-over painting that's going on in this canvas. But really, there are 3 central figures who seem completely distracted by whatever they're smoking in the foreground. But very quickly we notice that things aren't completely as they seem. There's an overturned cart in one place that seems to bleed into the city. There are women sitting and overlooking the drama that's playing out in the city. But at the same time, we see a riot of some sort breaking out on the top on the top right corner, from which the entire community that is shown over here is completely distracted. The art that's coming out of Baroda situates the artist in the society that they live in. They place him very much in the city. Even in this painting titled Speechless City. And I think there's something to be said about that title. It doesn't say Silent City, as one might assume by simply looking at the painting. It says Speechless City because it's talking about the abdication of civic responsibility that citizens in cities very often do because of the anonymity that's accorded to them by the crowd. The city is speechless, not silenced. It's a city that chooses not to speak up when injustice is being meted out. And these were painted soon after the first wave of riots broke out in these cities in Gujarat in the 1970s and 80s. And yet again, there is the ultimate, there is this very intimate and personal side to the paintings that these artists are creating. Over here we see a painting titled We Too by Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, where it shows him and his wife Nilima Sheikh standing in a small room of four walls in a almost surreal landscape with some sort of winged mythical being flying in the distance. And we see a rather similar composition by the artist Bhupen Thakkar, showing, in this case, again, Ghulam Muhammad himself with a friend of theirs, Mr. Hancock, discussing art and architecture, as the title indicates. And again, standing in a slightly surreal, nondescript, undulating landscape of trees. It's very pleasing to look at and makes one think of the sort of landscapes that one sees and the way the trees are even painted and drawn, the landscapes that one sees in miniature paintings. These artists are situating their subjects in landscapes. They aren't present in nondescript rooms without context. The context of their bodies is very important. This is a slightly graphic painting by the artist Bhupen Thakkar. And again, over here, we see a private moment playing out between these two men. The title indicates that the location of the painting is Banaras. We see these two men sharing a private moment indoors, and engaging in a private act, while we see the hypocrisy of Indian society as men lay themselves down before a giant lingam in a temple, while they shun ideas of homosexuality and those more broadly in the society they live in. In the 1980s, there is a new phenomenon that comes to the fore, and it's really the people at the forefront are a few artists working in Bombay, like Sudhir Patwardhan, Nalini Malani, and the artist Geev Patel. Here's one of my favorite paintings by Sudhir Patwardhan. A recent retrospective of his just concluded in Bombay at the National Gallery of Modern Art, and these are some detailed shots that I took over there. It's quite fascinating to see how the face is this rough-hewn, almost chiseled out of a rock, kind of thick-set appearance, where the neck and the head are one. The arms and the feet too are thick-set and painted incredibly roughly, whereas this figure sits alone in this Irani cafe, Irani restaurant, possibly Kiani's or one of the other famous establishments in Bombay, while everything around him is painted incredibly neatly and in great detail, including the other patrons of the cafe that can be seen and that can be seen in the distance. Excuse me for 1 second. I seem to have sorry. right? Yeah, and we see the other patrons in the background. This is another painting by Sudhir that's particularly interesting. At first, it seems like a regular scene from of a regular scene at a Mumbai platform with a local train in the background. But very quickly, we notice that there seems to be a figure almost disappearing out of the frame, laid out on a stretcher. And the title indicates as to what might have happened. It says "Accident on May Day." We see a train crammed full of people, and very consciously, while the clothes are brightly colored, Sudhir has painted the figures with a darker skin tone, emblematic of the Indian worker that works with his hands and toils in the sun. The feet and the hands also are exaggerated in size and scale, and the muscles of these people, their taut necks, the legs and the feet are very prominently displayed. And you can see that in the hands as well, because he's really trying to depict the struggles of the working class in Mumbai at the time in the 1980s. This is really a time when the union movements are in full swing. Jayaprakash Narayan has had his day in the sun in the late 70s. With his close friend, Geev Patel, we see a slightly different, more subtle approach. In his completely pared down canvases, we see a familiar sight of the gateway of India in the far distance, set against a clear blue sky. The Arabian Sea, however, is this mucky, green, algae-laden. You can almost smell the decay in it. While there's this gray wall that separates the pavement from the ocean, and these two figures standing in it. Now, when we look carefully, we realize, and if you have been to Bombay, you might realize, or if you live there, you might know where this, where the vantage point is from. It's standing with the Taj Mahal Hotel behind you and looking out towards the water. And Geev Patel is really focused on showing what we choose to unsee. In these touristy parts of town, most of us would either be looking at the Taj Mahal Hotel or the Gateway of India. And the gateway is present in the painting, but it's really these two figures with the yellow tarp on the wall, the palm fronds, a broken chappal, a few discarded newspapers, and a drunk coconut lying in the foreground. In another painting of his, which I really enjoy, titled Off Lamington Road, we see a whole cornucopia of life from the streets of Bombay playing out. In this painting, Geev is referencing the crowds one sees at the base of this crucifixion by Pietro Lorenzetti from 1320. While the crosses themselves aren't visible, we see them abstracted into the structure of the chawls one sees in the background. And really, he talks about how in this painting, I keep saying talks about, but he really depicts in the painting how people of all sorts, completely oblivious of each other, can coexist in a city, in a densely packed city like Bombay, where we see an injured figure on one side while people rejoice in the other. These contrasts, along with a taxi driver seemingly nonchalantly taking a break right in the middle of the painting, is quite interesting, and talks about what city life and how detached citizens of cities can be from each other. This is a portrait of Nalini Malani, of the artist Nasreen Mohammadi by the artist Nalini Malani that I particularly like, and I chose to include it over here. Nasreen Mohammadi would soon after the painting of this painting pass away. In fact, it's painted in the summer that Nasreen is diagnosed with the disease that would eventually take her, and it's painted entirely from memory. And this is something that Nalini does repeatedly in her paintings. At the time, she's living in Lohar Chal, which is a densely populated market part of Bombay, where she paints the figures and characters that she lives with and sees and encounters every day, but makes sure to do it completely from memory. Another artist who embodies certain ideas and really challenges our ideas of femininity is the artist Arpita Singh. In a very tongue-in-cheek manner, over here, she in the painting titled Durga, and another painting with similar iconography, we see a woman dressed in widow's garb, standing atop a man, maybe her husband, maybe her perpetrator, but really juxtaposing them with signs of domesticity, whether it's the fruits that we see hanging mid-air, or the flower pot that she holds in this case, or the bouquet of flowers in the other. But really, this is a woman taking charge. We see her holding a gun in her hand and shooting a man dead in both cases. The man seems to be recoiling towards the back, and it seems to be a man who with a knife in his hand in at least one of these paintings. And what we get here, and at the same time, by the way, I would like to call your attention to this little detail. With two of her hands, she adjusts her pallu, which is the sign of her domesticity and modesty in many ways. And it's just really tongue-in-cheek in the way Arpita chooses to chooses to depict women in her paintings, and men as well, completely surrounded by pretty flowers, but at the same time taking charge and taking their lives in their own control. Another artist, and I'm sorry that so many deities seem to be appearing in our presentation. Some of it was planned, but a lot of it was completely accidental. But we see the work of Madhvi Parekh, an artist whose work has a true joie de vivre, or the joy of life in her work. Madhvi is a self-taught artist who works with, who in the early years worked with a sketch pen and color pencils and colored pen that she would have lying around at her home. And she's really inspired by figures like Miro and Klee from the West, but she brings them together with sort of the more indigenous and tribal arts of India, and creates a very unique language for herself. This is a picture of the four women that we've just spoken about, four artists we've just spoken about: Madhvi Parekh, Nalini Malani, Arpita Singh, and Nilima Sheikh at Triveni Kala Sangam in Delhi in 1989, when they came together to produce a traveling show of their work at the time. And I couldn't resist, so I included another photograph of them taken 20 years later in the same order, standing in front of the painting, standing in front of that old photograph at Kiranadar Museum of Art in New Delhi last year on the occasion of Arpita Singh's retrospective exhibition over there. Now, in the late 1990s, we see something shift again. India is opening up. India opened up in the early 90s, and there's been a huge influx of money and resources into Indian hands. And we see that begin to affect art as well. But first, we're going to look at the artist Zarina Hashmi's work. Over here, what we're seeing is a work titled Home is a Foreign Place. And it is a portfolio of 36 prints that Zarina created in the year 1999. And the way she did it was she first started with 36 words that evoked a sense of home to her. Now, we start with the very mundane ideas of a house, a threshold, a window, a wall, but soon it starts to sublimate into something more abstract. The idea of the idea of earth and stars and the night sky and the moon and the axis on which the earth rotates. In further lines, we see her talking about the experience of a dust storm, followed by rain, followed by the fragrance of that fragrance of rain called petrichor that we so love here in India. And further on, she talks about journey itself, time, duration, and finally border, which also define home for her. What we must know about Zarina here is that she is an artist born at the cusp, it's like just slightly before partition, and is 9 years old when the country is split into two. She's born to a family of Muslim academics in Aligarh, and her family at first chooses to move to Pakistan and then moves back, and eventually moves back to Pakistan. But in the meantime, she's completed her degree in mathematics and is married to Saad, her husband, who is an Indian diplomat. So she travels the world first as a diplomat's wife, and then later as an artist. And really, this is someone who's lost any sense of a physical home that she ever had, because she would live most of her life in the United States after this point. So that house in Aligarh where she grew up is no longer home because the people aren't there. Her family has moved to a country that has never been home, and so that is not home either. So and is her home, her adopted home in New York, and that is, those are the ideas that she grapples with in her landmark work, Home is a Foreign Place. Another work by Zarina that I wanted to highlight was Dividing Line. This is the border that that in 1947 called the Radcliffe Line, really split the country in two, but also her life in many ways, in completely irreconcilable ways, not just for her, but for hundreds of millions of people who would be born years after that line was drawn. In the late 90s and early 2000s, we see another influence coming in from artists traveling to the West and really looking at the latest developments in art. And we see that with artworks like this titled Blood Wedding by Anita Dubé, where she takes human bones and beautifully creates these velvet embroideries on top of them, and creates necklaces and decorative objects titled Blood Wedding, which is part of the Devi Art Foundation collection at the moment. Another thing that happens is, sorry,
I'm just a 10-minute reminder.
Yeah, we're nearing the end.
Super. Okay.
Great. So another thing that happens is that scale completely explodes in the early 2000s with the coming of new resources and exposure to a world market. Indian art gets bigger. And we see that in this example of Shiva Chachi's work, which spans an entire room in the old Devi Art Foundation building, a work titled Ganga's Daughters from 2002. We see it again in Bharti Kher's work, where she depicts a life-size elephant, a life-size dying elephant with bindis covering its entire surface. The Skin Speaks a Language, Not Its Own is the title of this work from 2006. And at the time was, I think, the most expensive work to be auctioned off by a contemporary Indian artist. We also see another work titled Love, where literally a giant stainless steel dinosaur, this is a work by Sudarshan Shetty, makes love to a classic car. I mean, if it doesn't get more in your face and larger than life than that, really. But then we have another strain of that exists in art from the period that we're living in right now, which is this conceptual and poetic strain that, in my mind, is championed by artists like Shilpa Gupta, where over here she takes the idea of India, and instead of being didactic about it, takes it to the people and asks 100 different people to draw what they think the outline of the map of India looks like. And then she superimposes them one on top of the other to create this very poignant work titled 100 hand-drawn maps of India. By the way, years later, in the repeat edition of Sunil Khilnani's book, The Idea of India, this was used as the cover, and I thought they couldn't have, I think they couldn't have done with a more appropriate work of art. Again, we see in this work titled There Is No Border Here, we see her using this tongue-in-cheek humor where she takes caution tapes that are used to divide places and create borders and writes simply on them with words, there is no border here. And she kind of embodies that poetic humor that so many from her generation and the ones that have followed it have learned from eventually. There's another example titled I Live Under Your Sky Too, written in 3 different languages in neon, set against the sky in Bombay. And we come sort of full circle with this work by Atul Dodia, because another stream that we see in contemporary art is the referencing of art that has come before. we no longer simply reference other cultures, but we're also an artist like Atul Dodia very directly references artists who he considers his heroes. In this painting, he paraphrases the famous Rabindranath Tagore painting that we had seen earlier and superimposes I think his wife's face, the artist Anju Dodia, into the painting. We end close to where we began with Bharat Mata, depicted here by Pushpamala N, an artist who often recreates both paintings and photographs from history in her photographic works, typically with her as the protagonist. Thank you. Great.
Thank you so much, Keshav. That was beautiful and really, really insightful, even for me. And I think some of the images that you've chosen are a fantastic representation and not images that we often see in typical art history. So really, thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. It really made me brush up on my own art history. And I apologize once again to people who think I left out some key figures, because I definitely did. But
no, I'm sure, and it's such a vast field that I think that we do have to be cautious that in spite of the time that we have, this could really be a whole course session, and it really should be a full course, which is still not available in its full scale online at least. So opportunity there. So I'm just going to request everyone to continue asking questions on the Q&A tab that we have on the bottom here. Keshav, I'm going to start asking some that we've already gotten from the audience, and one of them, which I think is really interesting, that's come up. So this is the question by Aditi. What do we know of the influence of cities, Bombay, Mumbai, Calcutta, Delhi, Baroda, on works from 1970s and after? It's more to do with like Patwardhan and how it was such an influential, and also is there representation coming from smaller towns? And I think that's a really interesting question, because it's more apparent also where these artists are coming from, which schools are they appearing from, really.
Right. I think the smaller towns question is a more interesting one, and something that I'll have to think about a little bit more. But yes, I think we see the influence of cities very clearly in the art of artists like Patwardhan, as you pointed out, but also Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh and his depictions of the city, where the map itself becomes a starting point for these artists. I mean, with Bombay in Patwardhan, but it's not even Bombay in case of Patwardhan, but the suburbs of Bombay that he depicts, where he himself lives in Thane, a northern suburb of the city of Bombay. So yes, to answer your question, we do see the influence of cities. We see it in the works of artists like Sudhir Patwardhan, in the early works of artists like Nalini Malani as well. And definitely in works by artists like Nilima Sheikh and other Baroda school artists who talk about architecture and city plans. Another artist to look at is Zarina Hashmi, who has done an incredibly beautiful series on Delhi. The thing with Zarina, and she's one of my favorite artists, if it wasn't clear, because I kind of wedged her in there as well, is that she used to take flying lessons in Delhi in the 1960s and 70s. And a lot of her early work is actually inspired by looking at these cities, at the city of Delhi, which, you know, is actually 7 different cities built over centuries and millennia that she references in her work quite heavily early on.
Fantastic. Yes, I think it's a real question. I think Atul Dodia's work of the museums, the 100 museums, I think it was, does reference some other cities, but not, it was more imagination of what these future cities would be, not so much of what they are.
And really quickly, with Baroda, what we get is a very conscious effort to take the artists out of their studio practice and place them in the cities and to respond to it. And I think Ghulam Sheikh's work, more prominently than perhaps any others, captures that idea of the artist in society, in the city, exposed to the world and reacting to it. And Geet Patel.
Yes, most definitely. Yeah. Yes, most definitely. And it is actually a very unique challenge. And I think that more arts organizations that are based in these different cities. I know India Art Foundation did a call for Bangalore to create more site-specific or city-specific artworks and proposals that could be submitted. We did something similar at TIFA. So it is really also for the creative community of the city to respond to the environments that they're in. So I'll take the next question as well, which kind of leads into.
I had a quick point to make about smaller cities. I think Kochi is another great example of a city that's really fostered an artistic community, and it has its own network of galleries as well, based in the city that support these artists, and galleries like Mirchandani Steinrucker in Bombay is a huge champion for artists coming from Kerala more broadly, but specifically Kochi.
Most definitely. I think that's also the Kerala art scene is quite a flourishing scene for a long time now. So the next question that I will take is kind of bundled in one or two different questions, but it really looks at contemporary art and the way forward. So an anonymous attendee actually asked, where do you see the sands of Indian art history shifting for the next 5 to 10 years, given the political climate? But I think this also kind of ties in with ideas of contemporary art, conceptual art, and also how these understandings are not so much material anymore, but we are moving into kind of more experiential pieces, food. So are there certain trends that you're seeing? We're obviously seeing them globally, but how much of that is rippling into the India, and how does the market affect some of the more experimental practices?
I think we're seeing a lot of experimentation, and actually not just within art, but also with how art is disseminated. And I think here I'd like to mention initiatives like Art Chain India, where artists, especially in this time, are forced to question certain dogmatic ideas that exist in the art world, whether it's the artist-gallery relation and others that are really beginning to get questioned in this time. And we're seeing these new forms of engaging and reaching out happening in the times that we're living in right now. But I think, Trishla, you're in a better position to answer a question like that, given that you are at the forefront with TIFA, doing such fantastic work, engaging with artists, trying to do things that are different from what the market responds to necessarily.
I'll just very briefly say that the art market and the art ecosystem might be looked at here as two different things. Whether the art market will change in response to the experimental works, probably not, because people still see a huge amount of value in paintings primarily, although, however, we are seeing a lot of sculpture and also photography coming up as a major medium that people are wanting to collect and are willing to invest in today. But with that said, the experimental, especially things that you see at Biennales, things that you see at more experimental museums, also experimental spaces all across the country, and the work that they're showing today is really a sign of things to come. Video art is a very, very initial stage in India yet, but video art will possibly start to become more of a collectible item going forward. I know some collectors are starting to collect video art.
And do you think that also has to do with where technology is at, and is video art going to be able to be collected because things are changing there too?
Most definitely. I saw digital works by a museum in Japan that is really looking at not just collection of works, but also archiving of the digital works. And they kind of give you a guarantee that if you buy work from us today, we will kind of ensure it for the next 50 years. Because how will that file sit? What if the USB drive collapses?
This is a museum. This is a museum in Japan.
It was a museum shop that kind of released limited edition video pieces. I forget the name. It's Japanese, a little bit complicated.
Yes, and there are organizations like Rhizome in the US, for instance, that work very consciously towards preserving digital works of art, the technology for which keeps getting outdated every year. So there are efforts like that that are in play.
Most definitely. So I'll just quickly take the next question. Is how do we ensure an organized archive of Indian art which would be able to enable effective researches? And I know this is a big problem sector. Thank you, Shweta, for your question. Keshav, if you have any resources to share with our audiences.
Definitely. Well. I think, and this is a resource that I'm sure maybe Shweta is already familiar with, but the Asia Art Archive has done a fantastic job of cataloging the archives of artists, including Nilima Sheikh, Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh. In fact, some of the images and references that I used in my own presentation come from Asia Art Archive and their resources. So some of those are incredibly helpful. I think we need more things like this, and we need to somehow create an ecosystem where this information can be preserved, because what is happening is that there are artists that are falling through the cracks. There are artists we know very little about. I think one such artist is Damayanti Chawla, an artist who was active in Delhi. And I really wanted to include her work in this presentation, but I could find only one very pixelated image of her work on the internet. I mean, there are artists like, and we see this especially again with women artists, that especially if they've already passed on, especially in a pre-digital time, there's very little available to people about them, and that material is simply not there. And maybe it's there with the families, and initiatives like Asia Art Archive or local archives maybe can begin to harness that material and put it out there for researchers and interested parties alike.
Definitely. Someone did ask a question, is also there's the course on Indian art history online. However, there isn't yet. I know Gyan Prava and Bhavdaji Lad both have programs, but they're much longer programs. So, and online, as I said in the beginning, it is really an opportunity for someone to kind of string together a whole coursework, because we know both Keshav and I are very aware that a small session like this cannot give a full overview, also because each sector you can really spend decades kind of going into each aspect of each painting, each painter. And this also relates to the under-documentation of the scene at large that
Absolutely.
Keshav was saying. So where are the estates, who are the estate managers? Do we have documentation of Indian art? Because this is also a post-colonial problem, that we weren't in charge of our own archives in a certain sense.
I think another
I'll
point.
take the
Sorry, very quickly over here. Another thing I'd like to point out is that the market in some ways has stepped in over there. I think some of the biggest repositories of art, Indian art, on the internet today are auction house websites. In fact, many of my images come from there for this presentation as well. You can find high resolution images. Maybe there's a way in which an archive can harness this resource and partner with these auction houses to pull these images and their incredibly detailed cataloging into one place, so that it can all live in one location.
That's actually a great idea. That's a superb idea. And if any of you are in Pune, the TIFA library does have all the saffron art auction catalogs. Saffron themselves will have them in Bombay. I know someone in Delhi will definitely have them. So these are resources that are accessible, but still physically accessible. So that's one thing. Before I take the next question, I will, however, quickly let you know that we have posted a feedback link on the chat. So if you do have some time, please do take 1 minute and give us feedback. We'd love to incorporate it into our future sessions. Moving on to the next question by Gitanjali Joshi. What do you find is the dominant theme of artists lately? Has the influence of religion decreased dramatically? Also, do you find that art has become more provocative, or find that they carry a message more than they used to?
You know, it's very difficult to say, because the thing is, for every example of one of those things, there are counter examples available, and that's the nature of the times that we live in, that really no stream in art really runs dry ever. We just seem to add more and more themes and ideas that people talk about. It just so happens that a certain theme or idea might come to the fore more at a given point in time. And as an art world, we're obsessed with novelty and looking at whatever is new and out there. So all those streams that you mentioned, whether it's religion or carrying a message or being provocative, all of those things are there, but they also each have their own Achilles heel in who they can appeal to, and you know, religion by definition narrows the group of people that respond well to it, and the same is true for provocative works of art, because art, I think, at some level has ceased to be provocative. Anything really goes to, especially for seasoned art viewers, it's very difficult to surprise them with anything truly out there anymore. Sorry, I don't know if that answers the question, but that's...
No, I agree. Yet at the same time, Indian art, primarily in the way that it has evolved, does see a lot of referencing from mythology. And Aditi has asked that question earlier as well, is that kind of linkage has kind of loosened. And I do question if this is also because a lot of our references, especially as younger artists, a lot of us are looking westward. A lot of our research is a lot more global today. So we are looking less at our own history rather than a collective history. And that certainly would impact the kind of art that is created today. And also, I think from a buyer's need, maybe people are looking for more minimalistic or like a newer aesthetic. So the influences from mythology are getting more restrained in a certain sense.
And at the same time, it's important to recognize that artists' constituencies vary. For instance, there are artists who create, whose primary source of income is from the market, but then there are also artists today who fund themselves in other ways and are therefore able to, are responding to other needs and demands. There are artists who, in some cases, live entirely off of grants for projects that are difficult to collect, for instance. And in that case, they found alternate sources of funding. And I think sometimes, I don't want to be so cynical about this, but often the source of funding will define the kind of art that is being produced as well.
Yes, most definitely. And I think this leads us into our next question by Saurabh Shah, which is really to talk about how will the current pandemic influence the future of art, and kind of ties in with what we'll possibly see within the contemporary art sector, but also how you had mentioned kind of in your brief about the event is that what do times like this where we do see a huge amount of flux and previous fluxes that we have seen, what does this do for the creative community really, and how do we see these splurges that come up?
Yeah, I think the people in the best, I think nobody, it's almost too soon to answer a question like that, but and that's why I think it has to be an open discussion, and more than me, I think it's the artists who will show us the way, as they usually do, by creating the work that they do, and it's only in hindsight that we see what is extraordinary, and we see what comes out of a moment like this. At the moment, we can see all sorts of different things happening, but at the same time, we don't see a lot that is happening because we can't go and see work physically ourselves. So it's an interesting time, and I think we're all in a bit of a suspense right now. As far as the market is concerned, COVID has had a considerable impact on it. We see a lot of contemporary art buying, it seems to be drying up to some extent, whereas the sectors of the market that seem to be investment driven, for instance, to put it crassly, seem to be growing, in fact, in these difficult times. So it's a weird time that we're going through, and I think we'll need to wait for the dust to settle a little bit before we'll know exactly what has happened.
Most definitely. I think it's going to be a very long-term impact, and still some time before we can all normalize and go into living lives as we were. And maybe there will be a new normal. There will be no going back in a certain sense. I will take this opportunity to bring this webinar to a close. Thank you so much, Keshav, for taking all the questions, but also having agreed to do this fantastic webinar with us. We're really, really excited and happy to have had you here.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
And please also check us out on Instagram. We are FAQ Art Inc. On Instagram, and our website is faqart.com. You can find me at Keshav M on Instagram. And we look forward to hearing from you. And please do let me know what you thought of the talk and how I could do it differently. This is my first Zoom webinar, and the first thing that I've done of this sort. So thank you for the opportunity, Trishla. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Also, thank you to Pratika Purswani, Shaunak Peche, Siddhant Marlecha, Roshni from the TIFA team. And again, thank you to Art Fervor for being our fantastic collaborators on this session.